So before we get started, I want to point out that my goal in this video is not to just shit on feminism as a whole. I still consider myself a feminist for reasons I'll explain in a future video. This video is a critique of intersectionality and the direction it's taken the left since the early 1990s. As a theoretical framework, it can be a very useful tool, but as the backbone of left politics, I believe it is woefully ill-equipped to meet the very serious challenges that lay ahead. Okay, now that I got that please don't hate me out of the way, let's begin. Hello comrades and welcome to part 2.
So, what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is an analytical framework that looks at different forms of social stratification, be it race, gender, sexuality, or class, and how they overlap and interlock to create unique forms of oppression.
The term intersectionality was first coined in 1990 by feminist Kimberly Crenshaw as a means to get white feminists to recognize black women as double oppressed within the social hierarchy and enforced by dominant culture. Having emerged in the late 1980s, intersectionality has come to be not only the way to do feminist research, but has also come to dominate other fields and disciplines. Many believe intersectionality has brought about a paradigm shift in gender studies. However, this supposed shift has taken on a performative rather than concrete form. Well, I agree. It is the very bedrock of third and fourth wave feminism, and at first glance, it isn't totally useless. So let's unpack it a bit. Humans interact with society on 3 main levels: as members of the human race with common needs and drives, as members of one of numerous categories including gender, race, nationality, culture, and religion, and lastly, as an individual with their own distinct interests and abilities. The Enlightenment brought about universal liberalism, which focused on the first and the third. Universal human rights, which would then free individuals to follow their own paths. Yay, Enlightenment! Intersectionality focuses almost exclusively on the second. Group identity. But why these specific categories? Well, this video series is in response to Jordan Peterson's kooky narrative, so join me, won't you, as we watch a celebrated psychology professor completely botch and conflate the 3 totally independent concepts of postmodernism, intersectionality, and identity politics.
I can't quite figure out why the postmodernists have made the canonical distinctions they've made. Race, ethnicity, sexual proclivity, sexual gender identity, let's say. Those are 4 dimensions along which people vary. But there's a very large number of dimensions along which people vary. Here's some ways people differ: intelligence, temperament, geography, historical time. You live now and not 100 years ago. Attractiveness, youth. It's advantageous to be young. You've got potential. It's advantageous to be old. You've got wealth. Health, that's a good one. Sex. Women have advantages. Men have advantages. Maybe one has more than the other. It's not self-evident. Women live about 8 years longer. They're multi-orgasmic. Athleticism, wealth, family structure, friendship, education. Well, then there's the classic postmodern ones: race, ethnicity, etc. Why not those other dimensions of variation? There's no evidence that they're less important. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that they're more important. So, why not consider them? Then you get intersectionality. This is one of the things that's really comical, I think, because the postmodernists, identity politics types, actually realized this. They thought, well, okay, race and gender. Fair enough. Well, what if you're a black woman? Well, that's a problem because, well, now you've got 2 dimensions of differentiation. What the hell are we going to do about that? What if you're gay and black and female? Well, then what if you're not very bright and gay and black and female? And then what if you're ugly and not very bright and gay and black and female? And you can keep playing that game. You can keep playing that game an infinite number of ways, because there's an infinite number of ways to categorize things, as the postmodernists already pointed out. And so the intersectionality theorists came along to plug the hole, but they don't know where they're going. They don't understand that the logical conclusion of intersectionality is individuality. Because there's so many different ways of categorizing people's advantages and disadvantages that if you take that all the way out to the end, you say, well, the individual is the ultimate minority. And that's exactly right, and that's exactly what the West discovered. And in fact, the idea that there is more differences between groups than there is between individuals is actually the fundamental racist idea.
Right. Well, kinda. Peterson is correct to point out that the chosen categories are both arbitrary and self-serving in nature. Even the theory's own adherents admit that intersectionality is ambiguous and open-ended, and that its lack of clear-cut definition or even specific parameters has enabled it to be drawn upon in nearly any context of inquiry. But while Peterson and Marxists like myself see this as a bug, they see it as a feature, a strength, a universal theory, if you will. Or dare I say, a meta-narrative? Where Peterson's story falls apart is in his attempt to merge postmodernism and Marxism together and then shoehorn them into a conspiracy theory with intersectionality when they clearly don't fit. So let's just take a minute to clean up Jordan's mess here. First of all, postmodern philosophers explicitly reject totalizing narratives born of the Enlightenment, like, say, class struggle as the primary driver of history.
The reason that postmodern theorists rejected Marxism was not because it was no longer popular, but because they believed that it could no longer adequately describe the society we live in. In the book that introduces postmodernism into philosophy, The Postmodern Condition, Lyotard explicitly rejects the view that posits society into oppressor and oppressed as outdated, and so the common claim that postmodernism replicated Marxism's, quote, oppressor versus oppressed dynamic is false too. Now, to consider the related question of the validity of the term postmodern neo-Marxist. French postmodernists were influenced by Marx, but they were to an equal degree, if not more, influenced by completely different theoretical frameworks. Structuralism, Nietzsche, Freud, even Darwin. These were all greatly influential figures, and Marx was by no means the prioritized one.
And unlike the postmodernists, Marx didn't reject notions of reason, human nature, science, and social progress. He embraced them. Marx neither rejected hierarchies outright, nor did he call for some kind of absolute equality, like Peterson claims. On the other hand, most of the postmodern left holds tight to the belief that the only acceptable organizing structure is that of total egalitarianism. Think 70s communes and the Occupy movement. This isn't how Marx suggested we should organize against capital. As Marxist political scientist Eric Bronner points out, there is something deeply misguided about viewing power as a quantum in which less of it is good and more of it is bad. The issue is not the concentration of power, but its accountability. A movement that rejects seeking power is ultimately rejecting the possibility of lasting radical change. Whatever their flaws, Marxists have always understood this. So clearly, postmodernism and Marxism don't fit at all. So let's see how Peterson explains how intersectionality and postmodernism fit together within his conspiracy theory.
And it's like, well, if the postmodernists don't care about grand unifying narratives and they don't believe in identity, why in the world are they willing to believe in gender identity and sexual identity and racial identity and ethnic identity? And the answer to that is, well, they can't, but they don't care because coherence isn't on their agenda. And besides that, when push comes to shove, their postmodernism is nested inside a deeper Marxism, and so when the postmodern narrative doesn't suffice, say, to push forward the idea that Western civilization should be overturned, they just revert back to the overarching Marxism and say, well, those people are oppressed and that's a bad thing. It's like you might say, well, you're a postmodernist. It's like, you don't believe in any of that. And they say, well, yeah, I'm only a postmodernist this deep, but underneath that there's a Marxism, and I can always rely on that to fill in the gaps, and that's exactly what's happening. So that's what's happening.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening, and definitely not just total nonsense. I'll grant Peterson that it is true that intersectionality does borrow heavily from postmodernism, but the postmodern philosophers saw these categories as arbitrary, artificial, limiting, and in service of power structures. It's the intersectional feminists that have taken up this fixation on categories. One of the great insights bestowed upon us by postmodernism was the concept that race and whiteness are currently and always have been arbitrarily defined by and for the dominant culture
from the outset and throughout.
This is what the pomos mean when they say gender and race are social constructs. This doesn't mean that there aren't identifiable traits with which we can categorize. It just means our socially accepted categories are contingent on cultural context. For example, I am almost exactly 50% Irish, 50% Ukrainian. Today you would call me white, but just a century or two ago, I would count among the lesser races by Western definitions. I might even be denied immigration to Canada or America. Even today's race realists can't agree on who's white. So when Jordan Peterson claims that the postmodern neo-Marxists are in cahoots to dismantle Western society, he's completely out to lunch.
Remember these words. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
But while Peterson may have difficulty situating intersectionality within his conspiracy theory, it's still pretty problematic in its own right. First, you have the fact that members of the same category can have wildly different interpretations of their social status in the hierarchy and level of oppression. This is the problem of borrowing so heavily from standpoint theory. Its subjectivity is vulnerable to frequent paradoxes since it relies so heavily on self-reported experiences of people who may live multiple and conflicting intersections of oppression and privilege. There's a fancy French word for it. Total clusterfuck. Ironically though, history's greatest victims also seem to be intersectionality's greatest critics. Sharon Goldman of the Israeli-American Studies program at Shalem College criticized the ideology for favoring the powerless over the powerful, regardless of context. Any group that overcomes adversity, achieves independence, or defends itself successfully is seen as corrupt or imperialists by intersectional adherents. The example Goldman gives are the American Jews who, inspired by the abject victimhood of the Holocaust, subsequently engaged in politics to successfully advance their ideas into the American mainstream. American Jews are not given the benefit of the doubt by intersectional feminists because they proudly reject victimization. Yeah, the Jews aren't big fans. Writer and political pro-Israeli activist Chloe Valdari considers intersectionality a rigid system for determining who is virtuous and who is not, based on traits like skin color, gender, and financial status. Valdari also states, intersectionality's greatest flaw is in reducing human beings to political abstractions, which is never a tendency that turns out well, in part because it so severely flattens our complex human experience and therefore fails to adequately describe reality. As it turns out, one can be personally successful and still come from a historically oppressed community, or vice versa. The human experience is complex, multifaceted, and deeper than the superficial ways in which intersectionality describes it. I just want to quickly point out that both Sharon and Chloe are absolute trash, garbage people who support the Israeli apartheid state and have mayonnaise for brains, but they just so happen to be correct on this issue. Fiddlesticks. Intersectional critique of society is the correct path, and it's making a difference. Just look at some of our accomplishments. Okay, show us what you got. I'll have you know that in 2008, feminists made a decision to stop referring to abortion rights to describe pro-choice politics because it was deemed problematic by black women. You see, the white woman's quest for legal abortion failed to consider that for black women, the real problem was that they couldn't afford to raise children in the first place. Solution? Well, the white women had a meeting, and we agreed that our fight for abortion rights had been insensitive to the blacks. Intersectional success. Wait, that's your example? That's the kind of revolutionary action that's gonna change the world? Okay. Alright, well, we still got fourth wave feminism. You guys must have something to share with LeftTube. Take it away. Thanks, cis scum. In fourth wave feminism, dating from about 2012 to the present, total diversity, equity, and inclusion are the new core principles placed front and center. As for our successes, you'll be relieved to learn that the movement's inherent classism and ableism has been successfully declared problematic. You see, fourth wave feminism is largely defined by the technology that enables Twitter and Tumblr activism. And not everyone has the money or access to that technology, or the finger dexterity. And what about babies? Babies can't use Tumblr. That's ageism. What about cuttlefish? Technology marginalizes cuttlefish. That's problematic. Where was I? I'm being facetious here, but you get the point. What has the left's wholesale embrace of intersectionality accomplished in the last 3 decades? Gay rights, trans rights, the Me Too movement? Those were all going to happen anyway. There's no reason to think that intersectionality alone drove these movements. What has set this current wave apart is the explosion in technology and social media that has granted unprecedented power to wage a propaganda campaign unfiltered by the traditional gatekeepers of knowledge, the likes of which haven't been seen since the advent of the printing press. It's what makes these messages so potent, and it's what makes them so damaging to a free and dynamic learning environment.
Is social media partially to blame? Because
it's huge. Yeah. Social media is a huge part of this problem. So a professor just wrote to me recently. He said he got frustrated while trying to explain something. And he said, "Ah, shoot me now." And a student was offended by this because, are you making fun of people committing suicide? And okay, had she come to him and said, Professor, I know you didn't mean anything, but that was kind of insensitive. Okay, that would have been great. Like, that's the way to handle it. But for this generation, raised with call-out culture and social media, you almost never hear of a student coming to someone else in private because you don't get credit for that.
Yeah.
So you only get credit when you call them out publicly. And so that's why we're all walking on eggshells, because most of our students are great. Most of them are fine. But if I have a class of 300 students, a lecture class, I know that some of them subscribe to this new call-out culture, safetyism, morality. And so if I say one thing, it's not a reasonable person standard, it's a most sensitive person standard. I have to teach to the most sensitive person in the class. What we're seeing on campus is a spectacular collapse of trust between students and professors. And when we don't trust each other, we can't do our job. We can't risk provoking, being provocative, raising new ideas, raising uncomfortable ideas. We have to play it safe, and then everybody suffers.
Okay, so where do these interfems stand on class and capitalism in relation to every other intersecting form of oppression? Why don't I let them explain it? Individuals might stand at a crossroads of various intersecting oppressions, but early proponents of intersectionality clearly stated that this theory was about how oppressions were inextricably intertwined at a structural level. We would argue that capitalism as an economic system of exploitation does not sit on top of or in parallel to pre-existing separate systems of oppression such as patriarchy, racism, and heteronormativity, etc. Rather, we maintain that as capitalism developed historically, it depended upon and reproduced racism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. Did you catch that, left tube? Whenever any impure brocialist criticizes intersectionality for being an unproductive sideshow that sucks away all the attention from the main target, their response is to point out that capitalism doesn't exist in a vacuum. It develops by generating new forms of oppression or benefiting from old ones, like racism for colonialism and sexism for unpaid reproductive labor. And they're right. And it's also true that overthrowing capitalism won't magically dissolve all the other forms of bigotry. But also, yes it will. You see, a post-capitalist world is one without classes. No lords or serfs, masters or slaves, bosses or employees, citizens or aliens. Interfems, you said it yourselves, capitalism creates and relies on these other forms of oppression. So if you kill the Night King, all the other whites and White Walkers disappear too. Because they depend on his magic to power them. And so it goes for capitalism. Now, racism, sexism, and all the other isms may not explode immediately as soon as you defeat capitalism, but they will no longer be propped up by the capitalist class system. But these critiques, according to Interfems, fail to realize that intersectional feminism was always intended to function as a way to analyze capitalism and make resistance more effective after the collapse of the left in the 70s and 80s. You see, contrary to the traditional Marxist narrative, the failure of the left during this period was in part due to its incapacity to understand and reach out to the diverse groups that made up the working class. I mean, okay, sounds perfectly reasonable. Who wouldn't want a more effective and inclusive resistance? Together we're stronger, right? But that's not what happened, is it? You Interfems have had the run of the universities for the past 30 years. Where's the grand, unified, diverse coalition we were promised? Where's the solidarity? Until Occupy Wall Street and the Bernie bros you so gleefully dismiss, there has been exactly zero class consciousness in popular culture and mainstream media. Before that, not a peep about wealth inequality, and no one dared question capitalism itself. And sure, the left has been fighting lots of important battles. Black incarceration, policing, gay rights, trans rights, the anti-war movement, sexual harassment, indigenous rights, women's rights, Palestinian rights. But strangely, this schizophrenic approach has not led to the socialist utopia. Instead, and don't get triggered here, it led us straight to Donald Trump, Doug Ford, Brexit, and fake news. And again, I'm not blaming intersectionality for these election results. I'm just pointing out that with intersectionality at the helm of left politics, this is where we're at.
Overcoming cultural oppression isn't going to solve our deeper material problems. Understanding categories of oppression just isn't adequate if we want to change the fundamental structure of society itself. And intersectionality doesn't really give us a good theoretical lens for understanding the root problem of capitalism.
Capitalism is not just another garden variety form of oppression, like all the others. Here's some marks for you. It is the socioeconomic base from which all other discriminatory mechanisms that Interfems spend all their time on are deepened and intensified. Capitalism is the base that shapes the cultural superstructure. That's some Marx 101 there for you. And nor does Marxism reduce all power struggles, like racism and sexism, to class. It merely asserts that those struggles can be defined in relation to class. And classes are the product of our relations of production, be they slavery, feudal, or capitalist. And by the way, capitalism doesn't care how you identify. In the end, it is an equal opportunity exploiter. It just wants your time and money and labor. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, like a doctor doling out depression meds, intersectionality confronts the symptoms, not the cause.
Yeah, okay. The analysis so far has been pretty good. But where is he blaming all of this on capitalism? I haven't seen it yet. I think we need to take this analysis one deeper.
Thank you, Hans. That's a great idea. Modern intersectional feminism isn't just a liberal distraction. It has been entirely co-opted. Today it is deployed as neoliberal capitalism's preferred weapon in the war against solidarity. Neoliberal assumptions create the conditions allowing the founding conceptions of intersectionality to become diluted, disciplined, and disarticulated. Intersectionality originally focused on transformative and counter-hegemonic knowledge production and radical politics of social justice has been commodified and colonized for neoliberal regimes. A depoliticized intersectionality is particularly useful to a neoliberalism that reframes all values as market values. Identity-based radical politics are often turned into corporatized diversity tools, leveraged by dominant groups to attain various ideological and institutional goals. A range of minority struggles are incorporated into a market-driven and state-sanctioned governmentality of diversity. Diversity becomes a feature of neoliberal management, providing managerial precepts of good government and efficient business operations. Knowledge of diversity can be presented as marketable expertise in understanding and deploying multiple forms of difference simultaneously, a sought-after signifier of sound judgment and professionalism. If intersectionality ever had radical potential, today it's nothing more than a fancy bourgeois self-congratulating circle jerk. As with self-help, yoga, Instagram, and mindfulness, by emphasizing internal struggles over hegemonic structures, intersectionality has become a commodity. So let this be a reminder, whatever your political stripes, only socialism and solidarity have the ability to resist neoliberal assimilation and break the wheel.
Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell. They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
It's a beautiful dream. Stopping the wheel. You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
So where are we at today? Trapped under a smothering patchwork quilt of theorycraft and dogma, it's as if the intersectional left, either out of fear or procrastination, won't even consider attacking the final boss until we first dismantled the patriarchy, outed all the perverts and misogynists, and achieved total equality and inclusivity, which is of course impossible. So we're stuck outside the final boss's castle, collecting theoretical ammo and looting the corpses of the boss's infinite respawn minions. And the interfems seem happy to stay there as long as it keeps them relevant. It's a never-ending story, a mission without an end. They claim that only when we acknowledge all of our privileges and disadvantages can we mount an effective and wholly inclusive resistance to the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, as they put it. But rather than challenge the socio-economic order itself, intersectional feminism instead seeks to compel our existing institutions to adopt to their framework. You know what really grinds my gears about our oppressors? What? They're not black, gay, and female enough. They've co-opted themselves. It's bourgeois activism at best. They don't want to change the system. They just want a seat at the table. In stereotypically female manner, what they seek is validation.
The struggle not to be defined by identitarian categories became the quest to have identities recognized by a bourgeois big other.
To a large degree, intersectionality can be seen as a liberal cultural project. And while the socialist left shares many values with liberals around what should be culturally permissible, we generally don't operate under the illusion that these values can be realised under the capitalist system. So then you might ask, how should the socialist left engage with intersectionality? And as long as we don't use those values as a moralistic stick to beat other leftists with. As Marxists, we can use these ideas to build trust in our movements and create solidarity among working people. Then we can move forward together to destroy the structural enemy that we all share in common. Capitalism, don't you know? And we can do this with the most powerful weapon we have. Surprise, surprise, and with solidarity all along.
The vanguard of modern intersectional feminism is about as revolutionary as buying an I'm with her t-shirt. I'll let Reddit user and fellow comrade Hackle93 have the last word here. Any struggle which does not attempt to overthrow capitalism in one way or another will end up supporting it in a reactionary way, since it subverts the fundamental struggle, that is, class struggle. Do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. Consider supporting me on Patreon to fund the revolution. It's coming. Thumbs up if you liked the video. Thumbs down if you're a psychology professor and you think identity politics, postmodernism, and intersectionality all mean basically the same thing. Or maybe you're a leftist and you want to hit that thumbs down because you think unconscious bias training, better representation in movies, and trans women in sports consists of an effective leftist agenda. That's all we need. We could stop there. Revolution? That seems kind of try-hard, don't you think?